Actual avoidant describes the exact moment avoidants realize they lost you. Most people think that moment happens during the breakup. They imagine the avoidant sitting alone, overwhelmed with regret, instantly realizing the value of the person they just walked away from. But if you have ever loved an avoidant, you already know that is usually not how it works. In fact, the truth is almost the opposite. The exact moment an avoidant realizes they have truly lost you often arrives long after the relationship has ended, long after the last conversation, and long after everyone else assumes the story is over. And what makes this realization so painful is that by the time it finally reaches them, you have often already done the hardest thing imaginable. You have accepted that they may never become the person you needed them to be. If you've ever wondered what actually goes on inside an avoidant after someone important leaves their life, you're in the right place. And while you're here, take a second to subscribe. Not because anyone should chase what pulls away, but because understanding these patterns can save years of confusion, heartbreak, and self-doubt. Now let's get into what really happens behind the silence. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is that they do not care. People see the distance, the emotional walls, the mixed signals, and they assume there is simply no attachment underneath. But avoidant attachment is not defined by a lack of feelings. It is defined by a complicated relationship with feelings. The avoidant nervous system learns very early that emotional dependence feels dangerous. Closeness creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates risk, and risk creates anxiety. So when relationships become emotionally intense, the avoidant often experiences a powerful internal urge to create space. Not because the connection means nothing, but because the connection means too much. This is why the moment of separation rarely feels like a devastating loss to them. Their mind immediately shifts into self-protection mode. Instead of focusing on what is disappearing, they focus on what is being removed. The expectations, the emotional demands, the difficult conversations, the pressure to be vulnerable. Their attention naturally moves toward relief rather than grief. While the other person is often processing heartbreak in real time, the avoidant is still processing the feeling of escape. That delayed emotional response is what confuses so many people. It creates the illusion that the avoidant has moved on effortlessly when in reality, the emotional story has not even fully begun yet. This leads directly into the second phase, and it is one that many avoidants secretly experience but rarely admit. Relief comes first, not regret. In the days and weeks following separation, there is often a sense of emotional lightness. The constant tension that existed inside the relationship seems to disappear. They wake up without feeling obligated to answer difficult questions. They no longer feel exposed by someone's emotional needs. The uncomfortable pressure that closeness created suddenly fades into the background. For a while, this feels like proof that leaving was the right decision. The mind interprets relief as certainty. It mistakes reduced anxiety for genuine happiness. And because of that, the avoidant often doubles down on the belief that distance was necessary. What they don't realize is that relief and healing are not the same thing. Relief is the absence of pressure. Healing is the ability to remain connected without fear. Those are two very different experiences. The avoidant may feel calmer, but underneath that calmness, the deeper emotions remain untouched. They have not yet processed the loss itself. They have only escaped the immediate discomfort that intimacy was triggering inside them. And as long as that relief remains strong, they genuinely believe they are moving forward. But then something interesting begins to happen, even though the relationship is over. There is usually an assumption quietly living in the background. The assumption that you are still there. The assumption that if they wanted to reconnect, they probably could. The assumption that the emotional door remains unlocked. This is the third stage that many people never talk about. The silence they secretly expected you to break. Avoidants often become accustomed to a certain pattern. Whenever distance appears, someone eventually closes the gap. Whenever they pull away, someone reaches out. Whenever communication fades, someone sends the message that restores connection. Over time, this becomes emotionally familiar. Even after separation, part of them unconsciously expects that pattern to continue. They may not admit it to themselves, but there is often a hidden comfort in believing the bond still exists somewhere in the background. Maybe you'll text eventually. Maybe you'll check in. Maybe you'll leave some sign that the connection remains available. This belief allows them to stay emotionally detached without fully confronting the possibility of permanent loss. As long as they think access still exists, they do not have to process what life would feel like without it. Then comes the first crack in that illusion. It usually arrives quietly. No dramatic confrontation. No emotional speech. No final goodbye. Just the absence of something they expected to still be there. Your messages stop. Your reactions disappear. Your attempts to reconnect vanish completely. At first it seems insignificant. They tell themselves you are busy. They assume you'll eventually return. But as days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, a subtle discomfort begins to grow. The familiar pattern is no longer happening. Nobody is chasing. Nobody is reassuring. Nobody is proving that the connection remains active. And for perhaps the first time, they are forced to sit with a question they have been avoiding. What if this silence is real? What if the person who always reached back is no longer reaching at all? This is where the unconscious realization starts. Not fully formed, not yet painful enough to become grief, but strong enough to create emotional unease. The absence begins speaking louder than any argument ever did. The quiet becomes impossible to ignore. And then comes the fifth stage, the moment they notice your energy is gone. This is different from noticing your absence. Anyone can notice silence. What truly unsettles an avoidant is noticing emotional detachment, because throughout the relationship there was usually an invisible thread connecting the two of you. Even during conflict, even during distance, even during periods of uncertainty, they could still feel your emotional presence. They knew you cared, they knew you were invested, they knew part of your heart remained focused on them. But one day that feeling disappears. Maybe they see you moving forward. Maybe they hear through mutual connections that your life is changing. Maybe they simply sense that the emotional current they once relied upon has gone completely still. And that is when confusion begins turning into something deeper. Because for the first time, they are not reacting to your behavior. They are reacting to your absence of emotional attachment. They realize they are no longer occupying the same place inside your world. The person who once carried hope, patience, and understanding has finally redirected that energy elsewhere. And while they may not fully understand why it hurts yet, something inside them immediately recognizes the significance. The safety of knowing you were still emotionally available begins to disappear. The certainty they quietly relied upon starts slipping through their fingers. And without realizing it, they have just taken their first real step toward the exact moment avoidants finally understand what they have lost. What makes this stage so significant is that it introduces a feeling many avoidants spend years unconsciously trying to avoid: powerlessness. Up until now, there was still a sense of control. They could leave, create distance, distract themselves, and convince themselves that the connection remained available somewhere in the background. But when they begin to understand that your emotional energy is truly gone, they are confronted with something entirely different. They are no longer choosing distance. Distance is now choosing them. This is where the sixth stage begins, the disappearance of emotional access. Most avoidants do not immediately realize that what they miss is not necessarily constant communication or daily interaction. What they miss is access. The quiet comfort of knowing they could reach out if they wanted to. The belief that somewhere, somehow, they still occupied a special place in your heart. When that access disappears, something shifts internally. They begin recognizing that the emotional bridge they took for granted may no longer exist. They imagine reaching out and being met with indifference instead of warmth. They imagine finding a version of you that no longer waits, no longer hopes, and no longer revolves around their return. And suddenly what once felt permanent starts feeling fragile. The realization is unsettling because it exposes a truth they never fully considered. While they were protecting themselves from vulnerability, life continued moving forward. The person they assumed would always understand eventually learned how to stop waiting. The person they assumed would always leave the door open finally closed it. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of healing. And healing is often far more permanent than resentment. Resentment still looks back. Healing looks ahead. As this awareness grows, another experience begins forcing itself into their consciousness. They start seeing evidence that your life is continuing without them. Sometimes it happens through a casual update, sometimes through mutual connections, sometimes through a brief glimpse online. The details themselves are not always important. What matters is what those details represent. For months, perhaps even years, part of them unconsciously imagined themselves as a central figure in your emotional world. Even after separation, they assumed they still existed somewhere near the center of your thoughts. But now they see something unexpected. You are laughing again, growing again, building new experiences, creating memories they are not part of. And while outsiders might assume this should be easy to accept, for an avoidant, it often triggers a profound emotional reaction. This is the seventh stage, seeing you continue life without them. Not because they wanted you to suffer, most genuinely do not, but because your growth confirms something they were desperately hoping was not true. You are adapting to their absence. You are becoming someone who no longer needs the connection to survive. The relationship that once felt irreplaceable to you is no longer defining your future. For the first time, they begin experiencing the consequences of a reality they postponed confronting. You are no longer emotionally paused. You are moving. And every step forward you take quietly increases the distance between who you were and who you are becoming. This naturally leads into one of the deepest realizations of all, the end of their emotional safety net. Many avoidants do not consciously recognize how much comfort they draw from knowing someone genuinely loves them. They may resist that love, question it, pull away from it, yet they still rely on its existence. There is a strange security in knowing someone sees your flaws and stays anyway. Knowing someone understands your contradictions and still believes in your value. Knowing someone remains emotionally available despite the walls you build around yourself. The tragedy is that avoidants often recognize this security only after it disappears. Once your love is no longer quietly supporting them from the background, they begin noticing its absence everywhere. They realize there is no reassuring presence waiting on the other side of their withdrawal. No patient understanding cushioning every mistake. No familiar source of acceptance available whenever loneliness appears. The emotional safety net they spent years assuming would always exist is gone, and the loss feels bigger than they expected because it was never just about the relationship. It was about what the relationship represented. It represented certainty. It represented emotional refuge. It represented being deeply known by another person. Losing that is not simply losing a partner. It is losing a place where a part of them felt understood, even when they struggled to understand themselves. Then comes the stage where the distractions begin losing their effectiveness. For a long time, busyness may have protected them. Work, hobbies, new routines, endless stimulation, anything that prevented stillness, anything that kept difficult emotions from surfacing. But eventually, there are quiet moments that cannot be escaped. Late nights, empty weekends, unexpected memories, moments where the noise fades and they are left alone with themselves. This is where loneliness finally reaches the surface. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of emotional absence. The realization that freedom and connection are not opposites. The realization that independence cannot fully replace intimacy. Many avoidants spend years believing that the removal of emotional pressure will create lasting peace. Yet what they eventually discover is that peace without meaningful connection often becomes emptiness. And emptiness has a way of demanding attention. The conversations they once avoided now feel strangely valuable. The emotional closeness they once found overwhelming now appears comforting in memory. The person whose presence felt complicated now feels irreplaceable. This loneliness arrives gradually, almost invisibly, but once it settles in, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because for the first time, they are no longer feeling the anxiety of closeness. They are feeling the pain of absence. And that pain opens the door to something they spent most of the relationship resisting. Reflection. Real reflection. Not the kind designed to justify decisions, but the kind that forces uncomfortable honesty. This is the 10th stage, replaying old memories. At first, the memories arrive unexpectedly. A familiar place, a certain song, a random moment during an ordinary day. Suddenly they remember something small, a conversation, a look, a moment of kindness they barely acknowledged at the time. Then another memory appears, and another. What makes this process so powerful is that distance changes perspective. During the relationship, their focus often centered on what felt threatening, overwhelming, or uncomfortable. Their attention naturally magnified imperfections because imperfections justified emotional distance, but now the mind begins highlighting different things. The patience you showed, the effort you made, the understanding you offered even when you were hurting. Moments they once dismissed start carrying emotional weight. Moments they barely appreciated begin feeling precious. They replay arguments and realize you were often asking for connection, not control. They replay difficult conversations and recognize that what felt like pressure was sometimes simply vulnerability. They revisit memories they spent years minimizing and discover an entirely different story hidden inside them. A story where someone was trying to love them through walls they never fully lowered. A story where opportunities for deeper connection existed, but fear repeatedly stood in the way. And as these memories accumulate, something becomes increasingly difficult to deny. The person they lost was not just another chapter. The person they lost may have been offering something they are only now beginning to understand the value of. And once that realization begins to settle in, another shift occurs that many avoidants never expect. The memories stop being isolated moments and start becoming comparisons. Not intentional comparisons at first, just subtle observations that slowly accumulate over time. They meet new people. They engage in new conversations. They explore new possibilities. Yet something feels different. The emotional familiarity they once took for granted is missing. The patience they assumed was ordinary turns out to be rare. The level of understanding they receive becomes difficult to find. This is the 11th stage, the comparison phase. What makes this stage so powerful is that it often unfolds long after everyone assumes the avoidant has moved on. On the surface, life may look normal, but internally they begin measuring new experiences against memories they never fully processed. They start recognizing that not every connection offers emotional safety. Not every person stays through confusion, inconsistency, or emotional withdrawal. Not every relationship provides the same depth of acceptance. During the relationship, their focus naturally highlighted what was wrong. Now their perspective shifts toward what was right. The qualities they once overlooked become impossible to ignore. They notice the absence of emotional trust. They notice the absence of genuine understanding. They notice the absence of someone who cared enough to keep trying, even when things became difficult. And perhaps most painfully, they begin realizing that the connection they left behind was not as replaceable as they convinced themselves it was. What once seemed easy to walk away from now appears increasingly unique. The further they move into the future, the clearer the past becomes. As this comparison deepens, it creates the conditions for an even more uncomfortable emotional experience: regret. Not the dramatic kind people imagine, not endless crying or emotional collapse, but a quieter, heavier realization that settles into the spaces between thoughts. This is the 12th stage, the pain of missed opportunities. Avoidants often spend years protecting themselves from vulnerability without fully understanding what that protection costs. They become experts at avoiding discomfort, but in doing so, they also avoid possibilities. Possibilities for deeper intimacy, possibilities for emotional growth, possibilities for relationships that could have evolved into something extraordinary. And now those missed opportunities begin replaying themselves with startling clarity. They remember conversations they avoided because they felt too vulnerable. They remember moments where honesty could have changed everything. They remember opportunities to reassure, connect, apologize, or stay present instead of withdrawing. What hurts is not simply losing the relationship. What hurts is recognizing that there were countless moments where a different choice was available, moments where fear quietly won, moments where self-protection disguised itself as logic, moments where they convinced themselves distance was necessary when what was actually needed was courage. The human mind can tolerate many things, but one of the hardest experiences to carry is the awareness that something valuable might have survived if only a few different decisions had been made. That awareness does not arrive all at once. It grows, it expands, and with every memory, the weight becomes harder to ignore. Then comes the stage that gives this entire story its title. The exact moment reality finally lands. Not intellectually, emotionally, deeply, permanently. This is the 13th stage, the moment avoidants realize they truly lost you. Contrary to popular belief, this moment is rarely dramatic. It often happens during an ordinary day, a random afternoon, a quiet evening, a brief encounter with a memory. But suddenly something becomes undeniable. You are not coming back, not because you stopped loving, not because you became cold, not because you wanted revenge, but because your life continued, your healing continued, your growth continued. The possibility they quietly assumed would always exist has disappeared. The emotional door they believed would remain open forever is no longer theirs to walk through. And for the first time, they stop imagining reconnection as an option and start recognizing separation as a reality. This is where delayed grief begins transforming into genuine loss. Because as long as someone believes they can return whenever they choose, they have not truly experienced losing that person. Real loss begins when the possibility ends. Real loss begins when the future they assumed was available no longer exists. The avoidant suddenly understands that they are not missing a temporary absence. They are confronting a permanent change. The version of you who waited has disappeared. The version of you who endlessly understood has evolved, and the certainty they once relied upon is gone. In that moment, the full emotional impact finally reaches them. What follows is perhaps even more painful. They begin noticing that you have not only moved forward externally, you have moved forward internally. This is the 14th stage, realizing you truly let go. There is a profound difference between physical distance and emotional detachment. Physical distance can be crossed. Emotional detachment cannot be forced to reverse. And this is what many avoidants struggle to accept. They may understand that you are no longer in constant contact. They may understand that life has changed, but realizing that your heart no longer revolves around them is something entirely different. They notice that they no longer influence your emotional world. Their presence no longer creates the same reaction. Their absence no longer creates the same longing. The emotional bond that once connected every thought and decision has loosened, perhaps even disappeared. And what makes this realization so difficult is that it removes the final illusion. For a long time, they may have secretly believed that despite everything, they still occupied a unique emotional position within you. Now they begin understanding that healing has changed that reality. You are no longer carrying the relationship into every future possibility. You are no longer measuring life against what could have been. You have accepted what happened. You have integrated the loss. You have continued becoming yourself. The avoidant finally sees the consequence of your healing. It was never about punishing them. It was about freeing yourself. Yet from their perspective, watching that freedom unfold can feel heartbreaking because it confirms that the chapter they left unfinished has ended without them. And once that truth settles in, it forces a level of self-examination they have spent years avoiding. This is the 15th stage, the identity crisis that follows loss. Because eventually the focus shifts away from the relationship itself and toward something much deeper. They begin asking questions they never wanted to face. Why did closeness feel threatening? Why did vulnerability create so much fear? Why did someone else's love trigger withdrawal instead of safety? Why did they spend so much energy protecting themselves from the very connection they now miss? These questions strike at the center of their identity. For years, distance may have felt like strength. Independence may have felt like security. Emotional self-sufficiency may have felt like freedom. But now those beliefs begin cracking under the weight of experience. They start recognizing that some of what they called independence was actually avoidance. Some of what they called freedom was actually fear. Some of what they called self-protection was actually self-sabotage. This realization is deeply destabilizing because it challenges the story they have been telling themselves for years. The relationship is no longer the only thing under examination. Their entire emotional blueprint is. And for perhaps the first time, they are forced to confront a difficult possibility. Maybe losing you was not simply bad luck, bad timing, or incompatibility. Maybe it was the consequence of patterns they never learned to heal. And once that possibility enters the mind, it becomes impossible to completely ignore. Because the loss is no longer teaching them about you, it is teaching them about themselves. And once those questions begin surfacing, something remarkable happens. The emotions that were delayed for months, sometimes years, finally catch up. This is the 16th stage, and for many avoidants, it is one of the most overwhelming parts of the entire process, because it is the stage where they finally feel what they spent so long postponing. During the relationship, fear often occupied the space where grief should have been. During the breakup, relief occupied the space where sadness should have been. During the months that followed, distractions occupied the space where reflection should have been. But eventually there are no more substitutions, no more emotional detours, no more exits. The feelings arrive. Not all at once, but with enough force to change how they see everything that happened. They begin grieving moments that can never be repeated. They grieve conversations that never happened. They grieve the version of themselves that could have chosen differently. Most importantly, they grieve the loss of a person whose value became clear only after distance stripped away every distraction. This delayed grief often surprises avoidants because they genuinely believe they had already moved on. They thought the chapter was closed. They thought the emotions were resolved. But unresolved feelings do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They wait. And when they finally emerge, they often arrive carrying the weight of every emotion that was never fully processed in the first place. This is why some avoidants experience heartbreak much later than everyone expects. The loss does not hit when the relationship ends. It hits when the protective walls stop working. As that grief settles in, a powerful urge begins to grow beneath the surface. The urge to reach out, the urge to reconnect, the urge to somehow bridge the distance that now feels impossibly wide. This is the 17th stage, and it is often filled with internal conflict. From the outside, people sometimes imagine that if an avoidant misses someone enough, reaching out should be simple. But internally, it rarely feels simple at all. Because by this point, they are carrying much more than longing. They are carrying regret. They are carrying uncertainty. They are carrying the awareness that time has passed and that the other person may have changed in ways they can no longer predict. Every impulse to reconnect is met by another voice asking difficult questions. What if they have moved on? What if they no longer care? What if hearing from me only reopens old wounds? What if I am too late? And beneath all those fears exists another one that is even harder to admit. What if the person I miss most no longer sees me as important? So they hesitate. They imagine sending a message. They draft conversations in their mind. They replay possible outcomes. Some reach out. Many do not. But regardless of what action they take, the desire itself reveals something significant. For perhaps the first time, they are no longer running from connection, they are running toward it. The very intimacy that once felt threatening now feels valuable. The very vulnerability they once avoided now feels necessary. And that reversal speaks volumes about how much their understanding has changed. With that desire comes another emotional experience that is often invisible to everyone except the avoidant themselves. They begin thinking about everything they wish they had said. This is the 18th stage, the stage of unspoken truths. Human beings often assume that if someone loved them, they would have expressed it clearly. But avoidants frequently struggle to communicate what they feel in real time. Emotions are experienced internally, filtered through fear, and often left unspoken. As a result, entire worlds of affection can remain hidden beneath behaviors that appear detached on the surface. Now looking back, they begin recognizing all the words that never found their way into reality. The appreciation they never voiced, the gratitude they never expressed, the reassurance they never offered. They remember moments when they felt love but responded with silence. Moments when they felt fear but disguised it as distance. Moments when they needed connection but chose withdrawal instead. What makes this stage so painful is that clarity arrives after opportunity has disappeared. They finally understand how much certain moments mattered, but those moments belong to the past. They finally understand what they should have communicated, but the conversations are over. And so the mind keeps returning to alternate versions of history, alternate endings, alternate choices, alternate futures. Not because those futures still exist, but because the heart is trying to make sense of what was lost. Yet even with all this awareness, not every avoidant reaches back out. In fact, many never do. This is the 19th stage, and it is often misunderstood. People assume silence means indifference. But silence can also come from shame, from guilt, from the painful awareness that some damage cannot be undone by a single message. By this point, many avoidants recognize the role their patterns played in the loss. They understand how their fear affected the relationship. They understand the hurt that was caused. And sometimes that understanding creates its own barrier. They worry that reaching out would be selfish. They worry that they have forfeited the right to re-enter someone's life. They worry that hearing rejection would confirm their deepest fears about themselves. So they remain silent. Not because the person no longer matters, but because they matter so much that the possibility of rejection feels unbearable. There is a heartbreaking irony in this stage. The person who once created distance to avoid emotional pain now remains distant because emotional pain has become too real. The walls that were originally built for protection become prisons. And although some eventually find the courage to cross that distance, many spend years carrying feelings they never express. They continue living their lives while privately wondering about the person they lost. Wondering what might have happened if fear had not been in control. And that brings us to the final lesson hidden inside this entire journey. The 20th stage is not really about loss. It is about understanding. Because eventually, if enough reflection takes place, the avoidant begins seeing the deeper truth beneath everything that happened. The relationship was never destroyed by a lack of love. It was often damaged by a lack of safety around love. The problem was not necessarily the connection itself. The problem was the fear that the connection awakened. They begin understanding that vulnerability is not weakness, that intimacy is not loss of freedom, that depending on another person does not automatically lead to destruction. Most importantly, they begin understanding the cost of constantly choosing emotional distance. Every wall protects something, but every wall also blocks something. Every act of self-protection has a price, and sometimes that price is losing the very person who was trying to love you. This is the exact moment avoidants truly realize what they lost. Not when the relationship ended, not when the messages stopped, not even when loneliness appeared, but when they finally understand that the love they were protecting themselves from may have been the very thing they needed most. And by the time that realization fully settles into their heart, the person they once thought would always be there has already done something extraordinary. They have healed. They have grown. They have continued living, and whether the avoidant ever reaches out or not, that reality remains unchanged. Because the deepest lesson loss can teach is that love is not guaranteed by intention. It is sustained by courage, and when courage arrives too late, all that remains is the wisdom left behind by what could have been.